Florida case in 2000. The Supreme Court issued a ruling one day after they heard oral argument. So we could receive their ruling tomorrow, as quickly as tomorrow, on this case right here. Again, this is the Colorado case to determine if Trump can be tossed off the ballot. And this will determine how all states deal with this, unless they make a ruling on a technicality, which they could. But we'll see. Maybe the Supreme Court kicks Trump off the ballot nationwide tomorrow. That would definitely be a wrinkle in the 2024 presidential election, that's for sure. Surely Trump's going to win this. I just know it.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court. The Colorado Supreme Court held that President Donald J. Trump is constitutionally disqualified from serving as president under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. The Colorado Supreme Court's decision is wrong and should be reversed for numerous independent reasons. The first reason is that President Trump is not covered by Section 3 because the president is not an officer of the United States, as that term is used throughout the Constitution. Officer of the United States.
This is his argument. This is his first argument, that a technicality that the president is not an officer of the United States. That's just incredible to me that this is what it comes down to for these guys.
Refers only to appointed officials, and it does not.
Look at that. It's only appointed officials. There's some weird interpretation, as if the founding fathers wanted to have some loophole that the president was above this rule.
States, as that term is used throughout the Constitution. Officer of the United States refers only to appointed officials, and it does not encompass elected individuals such as the president or members of Congress. This is clear from the Commissions Clause, the Impeachment Clause, and the Appointments Clause, each of which uses officers of the United States to refer only to appointed and not elected officials. The second reason.
See, the argument I would use against this, I'm not going to pause this much as we go, but just this beginning part I think is interesting. The argument I would say is, at the time when this happened, thousands of elected officials in America applied for a waiver from Congress in order to keep serving in their position. Thousands of people, state officials, members of Congress, people that were part of the South, and after they lost, they applied for waivers from Congress. So if this did not apply to elected officials, then why did all those people apply for waivers?
Is that Section 3 cannot be used to exclude a presidential candidate from the ballot, even if that candidate is disqualified from serving as president under Section 3, because Congress can lift that disability after the candidate is elected, but before he takes office. A state cannot exclude any candidate for federal office from the ballot on account of Section 3, and any state that does so is violating the holding of term limits by altering the Constitution's qualifications for federal office. The Colorado Supreme Court's decision is no different from a state residency law that requires members of Congress to inhabit the state prior to Election Day, when the Constitution requires only that members of Congress inhabit the state that they represent when elected. In both situations, a state is accelerating the deadline to meet a constitutionally imposed qualification and is thereby violating the holding of term limits. And in this situation, a ruling from this court that affirms the decision below would not only violate term limits, but take away the votes of potentially tens of millions of Americans. I welcome the court's questions.
Mr. Mitchell, would you, you didn't spend much time on your argument with respect to whether or not Section 3 is self-executing. So would you address that? And in doing that, your argument is that it's not self-executing, but then in that case, what would the role of the state be? Or is it entirely up to Congress to implement the disqualification in Section 3?
It is entirely up to Congress, Justice Thomas.
So this is a new argument that I haven't heard before. Maybe other people have, but there's this idea that it may not even be up to the states or the courts to disqualify somebody, but Congress could refuse to seat them. It's their choice if they choose to seat somebody or not, or to certify somebody as president, by certifying the Electoral College votes. But interestingly enough, Clarence Thomas didn't ask a question on the Supreme Court for like 10 years, never asked a question. And yet in the last couple of years, he started really asking a lot of questions. And here he is as the first one out the gate to ask questions. Some people were demanding that he recuse himself from these cases that involved the presidential election or Trump running for re-election, because his wife, Jeannie, was actively involved in trying to overturn the 2020 election results, sending text messages and emails to people like Mark Meadows, Donald Trump's former chief of staff, pointing out evidence that the election was stolen. So he sleeps next to a crazy woman, and people were demanding that he recuse himself, but obviously he didn't.
Our argument goes beyond actually saying that Section 3 is non-self-executing. We need to say something more than that, because a non-self-executing treaty or a non-self-executing constitutional provision normally can still be enforced by a state if it chooses to enact legislation. The holding of Griffin's case goes beyond even that by saying that a state is not allowed to implement or enforce Section 3 of the 14th Amendment unless and until Congress enacts implementing legislation allowing it to do so. So under Griffin's case, which we believe is correctly decided, the Anderson litigants disagree with us on that point, but if this court were to adhere to the holding of Griffin's case, there would not be any role for the states in enforcing Section 3 unless Congress were to enact a statute that gives them that authority.
Counsel, what if somebody came into a state Secretary of State's office and said, I took the oath specified in Section 3. I participated in an insurrection, and I want to be on the ballot. Does the Secretary of State have the authority in that situation to say, no, you're disqualified?
No, the Secretary of State could not do that consistent with term limits, because even if the candidate is an admitted insurrectionist, Section 3 still allows the candidate to run for office and even win election to office, and then see whether Congress lifts that disability after the election. This happened.
See, that's his argument now. He's saying that the state doesn't even get to say. They're not the ones who get to determine if somebody's qualified or not when it comes to this, So if he argues that somebody could declare they're an insurrectionist and that they had sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution, and still the state could not remove them, they could be on the ballot, they could win the election, and then it's up to Congress if they certify that election results by either certifying the Electoral College votes or not seating that person in Congress if it's a race for Congress, or I guess the Senate, whatever. It's wild, man. This is just nutty stuff. But that's their argument, that the state's not the one who makes the call.
Frequently, in the wake of the 14th Amendment, where Confederate insurrectionists were elected to Congress, and sometimes they obtained a waiver, sometimes they did not, and each house would determine for itself whether to seat that elected insurrectionist, because each house is the sole judge of the qualifications of its members. So if a state banned even an admitted insurrectionist from the ballot, it would be adding to and altering the Constitution's qualifications for office, because under Section 3, the candidate need only qualify during the time the candidate holds the office to which he's been elected. And under Your Honor's hypothetical, the Secretary of State would be demanding, essentially, that the candidate obtain a waiver from Congress earlier than the candidate needs to obtain that waiver.
Well,
so that's another argument, that this doesn't apply to people running. This applies to people holding office. So you can't be disqualified from running. You can just be disqualified from holding the office if you win, if the legislative body decides to not seat you or certify the results.